Okay, hello and welcome to the final session of DevDays Europe 2021. And what an amazing conference it's been. We've seen talks on myriad different technologies. And to close out the conference, we're going to look at something slightly different. And the conference, as we planned today, really we were going to see ourselves in person, but we've had to change to online, a remote conference. And what we're going to talk about over the next 45 minutes together is the core skills that we need to build to be able to communicate effectively in the remote first world that we live in today. So over the course of the next 45 minutes together, we're going to cover communication from a number of perspectives. We're going to start with looking at culture and how it needs to form the core of any effective communication strategy. From there, we're going to look at process, and process from three distinct levels. We're going to look at organization-wide, we're going to look at team, and finally at a colleague level. At the organization level, we're going to look at communication architecture. What are all the processes you need to be able to bind your different teams together to build alignment? At the team level, we'll look at different communication methods. We'll look at two-way communication and explore some of the available channels that we have and the respective pros and cons. And finally, at the colleague level, we'll look at techniques that you can personally employ, be it you work as part of a large team or a small team, to improve your productivity and the visibility of your work. Before going further, I'd like to share a little bit about myself. So my name is Rob Crowley, and I'm the head of technology for VIX Technology. And at VIX, we believe in a better customer journey, and we challenge the perceptions of what transport within cities can be. We combine our extensive transport domain experience with cloud-native technologies to deliver compelling mobility as a service and automated fare collection solutions. And that might seem a little bit like a mouthful, but we'll explain later why I positioned that introduction in that particular way. Previous to that, I was a principal consultant for Telstra Purple, the largest consultancy in Australia. And the vast majority of my career has been in designing and operating distributed systems. And as such, you could say that I've always been involved or passionate about distributed communication. So if you spot some examples in today's talk where I use distributed computing terminology, you might be able to pick up why. I'm also the co-organizer of DDD Perth, Western Australia's largest IT conference. Also available on the socials at Rob D. Crowley. So at the start of 2020, remote working was the purview of a relatively small number of IT companies. And while many professionals supported some sort of remote working, maybe 1 to 2 days a week, the thought of a fully remote model was far from our minds. And this all changed with COVID-19, where many companies were forced to lurch into remote working with very little preparation. And so, how did VIX respond? Well, when faced with any situation with emergent behavior, we sought to create feedback loops to understand what we could improve. We recognized that this was not a normal way of working. It was not learning some new ways of working or improve a process, but rather our colleagues trying to work in a very stressful and confronting global pandemic. So we ran a number of surveys to gather both quantitative and qualitative data. The first survey we ran was a flexible working survey. And despite the difficult circumstances, what we saw were colleagues were adapting. In a remote working environment, a leader has no choice but to trust their people, trust their team members, and start measuring outcomes rather than outputs. And the qualitative data aligned with what we saw in the surveys. We were delivering outcomes to our customers. One of the key takeaways was 60% of respondents felt like working remotely had not impacted the quality of their interactions with colleagues. But that meant 40% did. Almost half of our colleagues felt that the quality or the value of the interactions that they had with the colleagues had improved, and again, could be improved moving forward. And this was the question that really prompted me to start researching remote communication techniques, and ultimately what led to giving this talk today. A key takeaway is that colleagues who were working flexibly had increased their productivity, work-life balance, and feeling of empowerment. This was very positive signs. But the question then became, how could we make this a sustainable approach that would not span just weeks or months or years, but form the basis for how our company worked moving forward? And this was very important because with remote working, companies get access to a larger pool of talent, but potentially a less sticky one. This could lead to future attrition. But with so many positive aspects, let's start looking at what's required to improve the quality of remote communication. And we'll begin looking at culture, as failing to understand cultural differences will almost certainly undermine the quality of not the interactions between your immediate team, but will be amplified in a remote context as well. And culture is really the key to building shared truth across your teams. So I've used that word communication a number of times in this talk already. And to ensure that we have a shared understanding or shared truth, let's provide a definition. For the purposes of this talk, when I say communication, I mean the exchanging of information between two or more parties by speaking, writing, or using another medium. So where do the communication exchanges happen within VIX engineering? At VIX, we have four main engineering hubs, one in Perth, one in Melbourne, Besançon and France, and Kosice in Slovakia, as well as colleagues based in Malaysia. We also have other teams in VIX that are scattered across the world, including Canada and the US. And the first challenge that may become apparent from this map is we have people in many different time zones. So you might think the pure time difference might be the biggest challenge. We can have up to 10 hours difference between our colleagues in Europe and Melbourne. And this can grow depending on the time of the year. And when you factor in our solution teams in the US, this can grow to a massive 18 hours. To put this in perspective, we have engineering teams across 4 countries. We have over 100 team members, 3 different time zones, and 15 plus nationalities. And the key lesson I have learned around this is that there are tougher challenges to overcome with remote communication than temporal coupling. And when I started my learning pathway, it was with a wonderful book by Erin Meyer called The Culture Map. And it provided an incredibly valuable insights into how one approach to communication needs to change based on the audience. Cultural patterns of behavior and belief impact our perception, thinking, and actions, and often in pretty major ways. For instance, the practice of Americans wrapping negative feedback with a layer of positivity is seldom one practiced by our French teams. And I had seen friction arising between our US and French teams around this very thing, but I hadn't been able to recognize it before. Or another example, why engaging directly with a team member rather than via their leader can be viewed negatively in a hierarchical society such as our French teams have. More recently, Erin Meyer has worked with Reed Hastings, the CEO and co-founder of Netflix, to investigate the underlying principles for building a corporate culture that is inventive, fast, and flexible. And that book is captured in the No Rule Rules. Again, a wonderful read that I recommend. And culture is so key. Gert Hofstede, who will explore our work shortly, had a wonderful description for it. And he called culture is the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes the members of one group from another. And Hofstede was a Dutch psychologist who did a pioneering study of company cultures across modern nations when he worked at IBM. So that was his studies covered over 70 divisions of IBM. And at the time was the largest cross-cultural database in the world. And from those surveys, he was able to generate some pretty groundbreaking insights. And he defined 6 cultural dimensions. And this is the framework of the theory that he is most famous for. And in this theory, he defines 6 dimensions: power distance, how much a culture respects authority, how likely a team is to simply blindly follow the rules of a leadership, individuality, the focus of a culture on how much they see the world in terms of I versus in terms of we. And we'll see how that collectivism versus individuality can actually impact at a country scale in the response to COVID, such as lockdowns. We'll look at long-term orientation, again, the focus of a country to make decisions towards medium or long-term. Uncertainty avoidance, the dimension that says how strong the rules a society will put in place to avoid ambiguity. So some cultures will place a lot of structures, rules, and processes, and they feel comfortable eliminating that gray space. Masculinity, how strong a culture focuses on being the best, on individual performance, and indulgence around satisfaction. And what I did is I looked at 4 of these key dimensions. So power distance, individuality, masculinity, and uncertainty avoidance. And I used these dimensions to map the behaviors of the cultures for the distribution of our engineering teams at Fix. And what I saw was quite interesting. In terms of the teams that we have, so again, you might be able to pick up from my accent that I am originally from Ireland. And we have teams in the UK, US, and Australia, all with a fairly low power distance ratio. So again, teams that will speak out if they don't agree with a message from a leader. However, with our teams in Malaysia and Slovakia, there is a very high power distance, so respect for hierarchical structures. So again, the respect for how power is unevenly distributed. If we look at individualism, so the degree of interdependence between a society, we again see clustering between our teams. So we see Malaysia having a strong collective view, again seeing the world in terms of we. And again, a high level of individualism. In the US, we have the Second Amendment. Individualism is baked into their very constitution. And by themselves, you might say that looks interesting, but if you start plotting it on a map, you can see that there are certain core groupings within our teams. And the insight here is the further away the teams or the cultures are on this map, the stronger the focus needs to be on the communication, or again, highlighting where those communication issues might arise. If we look at another 2 dimensions, so masculinity, so the fundamental issue here is what motivates people, wanting to be the best, the masculine side, or liking what you do. So a high score in the masculine dimension indicates that society will be driven by competition, achievement, and success being defined by who wins, who's the best in the field. A low-scoring feminine dimension is the dominant value in a society that are caring about quality of life, where the quality of life is the sign of the success, not the role title or the status from there. So an example of a country with a feminine values is in Scandinavia. So Denmark recorded a result of just 16 and Sweden 5. With uncertainty avoidance, we're looking at the focus to which the extent the team members of the culture are threatened by ambiguity, unknown situations, and they've created strong beliefs or rules of government to define that. So in low uncertainty avoidance countries, they define no more rules that are necessary, and teams thrive in ambiguity. Precision and punctuality, for instance, do not come naturally, and innovation is not seen as threatening. Japan is one of the countries with the highest uncertainty avoidance in the world, a score of 92, and Jamaica one of the lowest with just 13. So following the same process, we can again see clusterings of our teams. We can see that Australia, the US, and in this case, our teams in Slovakia, quite tightly grouped, but again, the outlier here is France. And you might say, this is interesting, but surely we are all individuals. We all have different personalities. And I'm casting a broad shadow over entire cultures. But there is an interesting fact that gets borne out that education tends to amplify the dominant cultural tendencies within an individual. Education reinforces it from the second time we get in school. Value systems, such as wanting to be the best in countries with a strong masculine dimension, are embedded in schools and continues from there. So again, in professions such as software delivery, product design, data, where a high degree of education and knowledge come to the fore, we are more likely to exhibit the dominant tendencies through the education structures that we have been through. So when interacting with someone from another culture, the best thing is to understand is to watch more, listen more, and speak less. Minimize the use of colloquialisms, local terms, slang. Limit the use of idioms and localized expressions. Think about the audience to which we're talking. And the first response might be, maybe we should just create a team that all have like minds, that all come from a similar cultural background. But we need to embrace diversity of gender, thought, experience, and understand how we communicate effectively. This is a problem that's worth solving. It is not an easy problem, but it is one that will form the foundation for sustainable growth moving forward. And with anything, misunderstandings are inevitable. Nip issues in the bud before they escalate. An early apology can be incredibly powerful for binding a team together. So culture, communication is hard. Cross-cultural communication is even harder. Cultural engagement first, and then look at process improvements. If you look at process or technology as a solution, you will miss creating the valuable connection between our teams. Tools such as Slack or Zoom are an amazing medium, but understanding your people is the first step. HOFSTEDE'S cultural dimensions illuminate the values of countries and can provide valuable insights into designing how you will communicate and tailor your messages to different teams. Don't try to create a monoculture. It will hurt you in the long run. And finally, disagreements and misunderstandings will occur. Move on. So with a base level of understanding around culture established, let's look at what we need to do in order to communicate, the process. So let's shift our attention to the how. Most companies don't have communication challenges. They have miscommunication challenges, and I feel this distinction is an important one. One of the most significant challenges with communication is that it's difficult to identify when it's not working well. There's no clear signs to go, oh, that's not working well. You have to be able to assess and measure that, and that's challenging. And a remote communication environment makes it even trickier. We often don't see body language or the behavior of someone being withdrawn within meetings. We have a far lower signal to noise value chain on that. We miss out on water cooler conversations or corridor conversations. And establishing effective communication patterns in a remote working environment requires dedicated effort from all levels of the organization. And this doesn't happen by chance. One of the first things I did at VIX was to look at how we communicate across our teams. And we defined a communication architecture. And this is a company's documented set of practices, processes, and associated tools for how and when people should communicate. And the intent of the architecture is to promote effective communication and distributed decisions across the organization. And this covers all the tools that the organization uses, the channels, meetings, wikis, emails, and how and when each should be used. And this is not a carbon copy for every team or for every organization. Many tools can be used in multiple ways, for instance, email. So at VIX, we looked at embracing asynchronous communication. We saw that the company culture's default was a high amount of synchronous in-person meetings, where everyone needed to be present for a particular period of time to be able to communicate. But when you have teams distributed across 15-hour differences in time, the window of overlap became incredibly small, and we could see that we couldn't scale that out. However, what we also looked at is the ephemeral communication. So chat windows, you could say that we could just shift a lot of the in-person communications to chat, but that disappears. We wanted to ensure that our knowledge management would retain. So if we made a decision, people would be able to come back to it later to review it. So we looked at work management tools. So again, the use of Jira. We looked at collaborative documents, so Miro, Mural. We also looked at Confluence and shifted the majority of our communication to those platforms. And so the rise of technical writing became an incredibly important skill for everyone at Fix. And it is incredibly important to codify the desired usage for semi-synchronous tools. Failure to do so will simply replicate existing behaviors. So for instance, with email, establishing a clear guidance that an instant response is not expected. It is an asynchronous form of communication. So if you require an immediate response, then that is not a suitable channel to use. Rather, look at chat. However, if you're looking at chat and you're going between 3 or 4 back and forths, then again, it's time to go long form and use a collaborative document to ensure that all of the context is captured and accessible to other team members. And the key point around any change is leaders need to lead. And leadership in a remote working company is responsible for deeply understanding how communication needs to work, and then writing it down and leading by example. And there are leaders and there are those who lead. And leaders have a position of authority, but there are also those who lead through inspiration. These unofficial leaders can be incredible champions for driving the behavior change. It doesn't need to come from management alone. Look at people in your organization who are exemplifying the behaviors you wish to see and give them a platform to expand their influence. And this was the single biggest tip that we had for changing the in-person meeting culture to one that embraced asynchronicity and long-form technical writing. Likewise, an engaged HR team is a wonderful asset. They can provide training around core skills that can be uplifted across the organization. So how to give and provide feedback, how to negotiate, and how to influence. And one of the key things about organizational performance is around the reason underpinning it. And at VIX, we have a number of values. We have accountability, collaborative, innovative, passionate, honest, and bold. And they are really the why behind the business. But they don't capture, they're not very actionable for colleagues. It's difficult to look at those words on a wall and understand how to act. At the next stage, then defining a set of principles. So how should those values be applied in more concrete terms? And finally, once you have that basis, you can then drive the behavior of your teams. And this is incredibly important for setting out what is important to your company. I would ask each of you to think, do you know your company's values? And are they lived and breathed? That was, again, another key change of defining a set of principles to bridge the gap between the raw values and the ultimate behavior we wish to see. And this is harder than it may seem. Let's look at a case study from Enron. So once the darling of Wall Street in the US, once declared the most innovative company for 6 consecutive years by the Fortune magazine. This company deliberately misled regulators, and the price of Enron shares went from over $90 to just 26 cents at bankruptcy. And guess what? These companies' values were integrity, communication, respect, and excellence. You could see that the actions of the leadership were in no way aligned to the company values. So when you don't have authentic action, you are not going to see the message resonate with authenticity across your teams. And in fact, the misdeeds at Enron led to the introduction of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. So if you've ever worked with a company with a US public presence, or one of its distributors, then you will need to look at the SOX audit. And again, this is where it came from. So define clear guidelines that codify the rules of etiquette within an organization-wide communication. What do you deem acceptable in terms of tone, in terms of message, in terms of content? And make sure that it's clear for everyone to align to. And a company's goals, as well as its scale and maturity, will drive the level of guidance required. So, for instance, at GitLab, a company that has been remote from day one, they have over 16,000 words in their particular communication guidelines, and they go down to a ridiculous level of detail across the board. But that is what they laid out on day one to allow their company to scale to hundreds of developers over time. If you're in a smaller startup, then a simple wiki page might be enough to start with. But again, the goal is to build alignment, not just in terms of message and channels, but also the content between your teams. One of the major forms of communication across an organization is announcements, those one-way status updates that come from the leader to say, here's an acquisition or a great success. And what are some of the key attributes of an announcement? Well, apart from inspiring, an announcement should be available, so everyone should be able to access it. It should be referenceable. So again, we should be able to share potentially a link or another way of accessing that information. And it should be persistent. So if someone isn't there at the time, that they can refer to it later for context. So why do companies often choose email when it has exactly 0 of these properties? Because it's convenient, because it's formed a habit, not because it's effective. So email is decentralized. There's no permanent record in a permanent place where people can see. If you have a new team member join your team, they will never be able to access it if the email was sent before they joined. Everyone has their own copy. They might be deleted. It's not permanent. You can't access it later. So how can you steer people away from email to a persistent channel, be it in Slack or another form on your company wiki or intranet for key announcements? And you can actually use email as a nice hook for this. So one of the tips I got from Tatham Oddie, one of the leaders at Telstra Purple, was to engage via email, but then provide a link to the content choice in the core platform. And the link that you provide should mirror the access path in the application. So if you look at the case of the DevDays Europe website, you can go to the core website and then the schedule and then the talk. And that might seem like a piece of work, but what you're doing as you do that is allowing people to understand, once you are in that source application, how should you navigate to find that content and similar content in future. So mirroring the breadcrumb or access path of the application encourages teams to then find out more or similar information within it, rather than an opaque link with a GUID as the ID. And bonus round, pay attention to the content metadata tags to improve searchability moving forward. So if that's in Confluence, look at the labeling and tags so that future team members can find related content across the base, not just in a page hierarchy. And so a quick note on communication. Effective communication ensures that we are landing the message and the tone well with each one of our teams. But we can often over-communicate as well. We want efficient communication, which is effective, but eliminating the waste. And communicating extraneous information between teams is waste. So again, we looked at a lot at VIX around team boundaries and levels of autonomy to understand where are the interfaces between the teams and what was the communication that was valuable between teams versus which was indicative of teams needing to collaborate on an outcome rather than one team being able to own that end to end. And we saw that manifest in technically orientated teams, which would then produce an input that another team would consume. And in some cases, we combined the teams to allow an end-to-end outcome, or we clarified that as consuming X as a service, as per the team topologies book by Michael Skelton and Manuel Paz, which defined the interaction patterns between teams, and again has influenced a lot of my thinking in terms of team definitions. And over-communication of information that is not relevant to a team doesn't increase the team's cognitive load. It creates extra noise for a team. And again, these team boundaries are absolutely critical to team success. So choosing the right communication strategy is key. Choosing the tone, being able to pick the audience, but also thinking, is this information that is actually needed to be sent to the teams? Ensuring that the signal to noise ratio remains high, particularly for the company or department-wide broadcasts. Communication requires context, and sharing the why is incredibly important. And choose channels that have the adequate bandwidth for the target audience. So with that, while a face-to-face meeting can have the highest level of bandwidth in terms of body language, tone, message, it also requires both people to be present at the same time. Technical writing can be one of the coldest mediums. It's very hard to understand certain tones or certain messages from there or feelings. But potentially using something like Miro or Miro for collaborative two-way communication and then going through to long-form technical documents is an effective way of bridging that gap with multiple tools. And effectiveness should be the priority with remote communication. Efficiency is an optimization after time. So at the team level, they often this phrase, the silence is golden, but in a team environment, it can be absolutely deadly. And the ability for a team to communicate asynchronously will be one of the most valuable skills that a team can learn. And when a team is communicating asynchronously, the channel that has the required social bandwidth to support the effective exchange of communication, as defined in the communication architecture, is the one that should be chosen. And many companies have this obsession with immediate responses. And one of the key behavior changes we needed to embed at VIX was never to expect someone to have an immediate reply unless it's a true emergency. And the expectation of an immediate response is toxic. Allow sufficient time for an important conversation to develop. And Basecamp have a wealth of tips and guidance to provide around that. And I will provide a link to that in the resources section at the end of this talk. So with team meetings, two-way group collaboration. This is really the default that many organizations use. And the guidance here is use meetings judiciously and consider them a fallback and not the default. They can be very easy with a lack of preparation to just get people together and look at an outcome. But we often lose time at the start. We kind of meander through, and then finally there's a bunch of actions that are hurriedly taken at the end. There are often better ways of defining a document up front that can be socialized, maybe with individuals or core groups. And then you can get people together, but once the context is set, so you can have a shorter time where everyone needs to be together for the truly high interactivity or collaborative aspects of it. There is a great book by David Marquette called Turn the Ship Around. And in the book, he defines a strategy for ensuring high quality meetings. And that is certified don't brief. So similar to the 6-page memo with Amazon, send the details around before the meeting. And then in the session, ask questions of each other to confirm the understanding of that, rather than a briefing session where 45 minutes is spent in one-way flow of communicating from the presenter to the audience and very little time for interactivity towards the end. And I have seen this result in shorter meeting durations, having increased focus in the teams, getting everyone involved rather than one person talking and the rest of the group sitting back passively, and also promoting leader-to-leader interaction, so the exchange of opinions and facts rather than one-way acceptance. And group chat. I have a fairly maybe unpopular or unconventional view with group chat, and I really limit its use across the engineering teams at VIX. Group chat, when we first went to a remote way of working, would be up on everyone's screens all day long with myriad different channels, topics, often interruptions every few seconds. And group chat is really like being in an all-day meeting with random participants and no agenda. It can be incredibly mentally draining. So a rule of thumb, if there's more than 3 or 4 back and forth exchanges on a design topic, then go long form and move to a wiki or collaborative document as defined by the communication architecture. And then a quick note on trust. One of the key things to enable teams to collaborate effectively is having trust or faith that each team has each other's back, that you will strive together to achieve an outcome. An asymmetry of information can lead to an erosion of trust. And a classic case of this is the used car salesman. So typically they know far more about the car than you do. And you always have that feeling that they're holding something back, that they're not being completely transparent. And this has led to a lack of trust. So again, when you're looking with remote workers polling for information updates is a strong indicator of information asymmetry. If you're having certain team members continually having to go, can you provide me an update on this? Or what's happened with that? That is one of those warning signs to say, are you sufficiently pushing context out to those remote teams or remote workers to enable effective distributed decisions, effective decisions at the edge? And making work visible is absolutely key. And transparency is the solution for that. So one of the things we've done in terms of career progression is the shift to OKRs, where everyone's personal goals are then made visible so that people can align on it. And promoting a value of transparency is incredibly valuable. And in fact, companies like Stripe have defined email transparency policies across the board. So with team comms, asynchronous often and synchronous seldom. And this is a skill and a decision that you will need to make and practice over time. Meetings are expensive, so share the context up front. And chat is great for quick exchanges, but be wary of group chat. And information siloing erodes trust, and transparency is the best cure for this. At an individual level, communication really is the core skill that will allow us to progress in our career. And that could be exchanging a technical idea or talking to a stakeholder or another team member. What you can do in your own careers is work out loud. In the same way at a team level of making the team's work visible, make your own work visible. Share with your teammates, share with your teams about what you're working either in your personal time or again, sharing this is what I'm doing today, and not just in stand-ups, but being able to share that out loud. Narrating your work, providing context around it. This will not just provide increased visibility, but also promote that transparency for other team members. I've seen incredible context shared and then aligned learning opportunities on the back of 2 people who suddenly discovered they had a shared passion, or be able to highlight another way of solving a problem. Make your work visible and explain the approach and thinking. This is even more important when working remotely because corridor conversations are not as easy. Setting clear learning goals and look for opportunities. And at VIX, we've used OKRs to capture this. And be open to feedback, and it will come in many forms. And often not positive or constructive, but every piece of feedback is an opportunity to make a decision on how to act or behave differently. In the last few minutes, I'll take out the crystal ball and make a number of predictions beyond the current pandemic times that we're working in. And the first is based on the observation that I've seen at VIX, that communication worsened within the regions themselves, but improved between regions because we had democratized access to information. And this was quite a big surprise that by leveling the playing field, we had brought in our remote teams and actually had them more engaged. And one of the things that we considered is in Australia, where we're fortunate, where COVID has not hit as strongly as in the UK or France, is whether we would bring our teams back into the office. So Apple earlier this week issued a missive from Tim Cook where Apple workers would come in 3 days a week in the office. And I'm firmly of the belief that hybrid working environments offer the worst of both worlds. You need to deliver multiple colleague experiences. So colleague experiences that are for people who are in the office and also remotely. So again, onboarding needs to differ. You need to have multiple processes from there. But again, you're providing a way for corridor or water cooler conversations to happen. And again, creating that information asymmetry or siloing of information. And while companies had little time to prepare for remote working, they should consider any change to stop or change it very carefully. You may just be throwing away a major advantage. And so the takeaways. Remote communication is difficult. It will require planning and commitment from multiple levels of the organization. Looking at the culture and the distribution of your teams is an incredibly important first step, because that will provide insight into how teams should communicate and how you can tailor messages to ensure that there is shared understanding between those teams. With that, you can look at organization-wide communication, looking at a communication architecture, which will codify how communication should take place. Working with your HR or training providers to help build skills in technical writing, remote communication, and asynchronous communication is an incredibly valuable accelerator for this as well. At the team level, looking at knowledge management tools, looking at the use of Slack or similar messaging tools versus longer, more persistent mediums as well. And ensuring that team meetings are kept to highly interactive or highly collaborative areas, and looking at mural recorded meetings if you're going to have people across multiple time zones as a way of getting that information, but favoring asynchronous first. And finally, looking at trust, so building transparency across your teams. And you can do that by championing it yourself in terms of working out loud, narrating your work, and being that catalyst for change within your organization. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for your attendance today. I'd like to thank all the speakers for all the sessions today. And for our partners, so presenting the golden sponsor, we have Allegro, who is the most popular shopping platform in Poland and one of the largest e-commerce sites in Europe. And 20 million customers every month visit this platform. We have our silver sponsor, Neoflex, who creates IT platforms for digital business transformation, which helps their customers gain a sustainable competitive advantage in this digital era. And we have our bronze sponsors. We have Metasite, who does bespoke financial platforms and application design, engineering, and integration. And again, constantly explore the latest IT trends and tools and enjoying in our autonomous teams. We have Telesoftas, is a consulting and product engineering company with a unique culture, again, incredibly important, and help businesses build a full product from start to finish, be it back-end development, enterprise web application, UX, or design. And finally, we have Voltus IT, a fast-growing innovative technologies company on a mission to create a vehicle assistant for daily drivers. So without these sponsors and their support, we wouldn't have been able to have this conference. So a massive thank you to them all. And finally, I would encourage you to rate the sessions that you attended today and share your experience on the social platforms. I will be around after this talk for any comments or questions, so that you can either reach me in Pine or on the Slack channels as well. And so with that, I'd like to thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to speaking soon.